I believe it was yesterday, I whipped up a mighty good batch of cornbread. Now, I say I whipped it up. It's one of those ones in a box, right? So I put exactly like three things together, and it was a culinary masterpiece, all my own doing, of course. But man, that stuff was good. I ate it. I ate a little more of it today when Liz was sleeping, so not any left. I told her I'd make her some more if she was wanting some. But I figure if I had to eat that every meal over and over and over again, I might get a little tired of it. Now, I think it would take several meals for me to get there. I love some cornbread, especially you put some butter on it and melt it and all that kind of stuff. But eventually, anything, no matter how good it is, it's going to get a little old. That's kind of where the Israelites were when we come to Numbers 11. The Israelites are being fed by God. They're being fed with manna. This manna, it is basically a substance. It's kind of hard to even wrap our minds around, really, because we weren't there. But the substance is kind of like, almost like a seed or something, kind of a grainy seed. It drops on the ground, like dew drops on the ground, and you're able to kind of collect it together, and you're able to make it into like cakes or something like that. Not cakes like birthday cake like we think of. Cakes like bread, like almost like a pancake type consistency maybe. And we're told it tasted, in some translations it says it tasted like, wafers with honey. Other places it tastes like cakes with oil. It's not a bad flavor. In fact, I would venture to guess that if we were to try some of it, if we had access to it somehow today, we'd probably like it pretty well. But nonetheless, after days turn to weeks and weeks turn to months, I do imagine it would get kind of old. But we got to remember something as we are going into our story this evening. What we got to remember is that Israel was not in their homeland having to eat the same meal over and over and over again. They're on the road. They're in the wilderness, in fact. And there is not nearly enough in this area to sustain this many people without literally some kind of divine intervention. There's a reason this place is called the wilderness. There's a reason why not many people live here, except for maybe a few nomads and so forth. This is not a place that is able to sustain much human life. And so this manna is not a preference. This is the difference between life and death. This is the difference between them being able to continue their journey and eventually make it somewhere, and they know that there's somewhere they're going. It's not like they're planning on wandering in the wilderness forever, although there's some irony there, right, if we know the rest of the story. But nonetheless, this is, by all measures, meant to be a temporary means of keeping them alive until they get where they're going. And not only that, it's a demonstration of God's power in a very striking way. But I guess that's not always good enough, is it? Now, I can't say that I would not be one of the ones getting a little bit annoyed eating manna day after day after day, because I know myself. I think I would get a little annoyed eventually. But Israel is at the point where they're tired of this manna stuff. And so they start complaining, they start murmuring. They've never done that before, right? But they start complaining, they start murmuring. They're saying, well, think about all the things we had to eat in Egypt. We had lentils, we had leeks, we had all these different kinds of meats. And of course, knowing a little bit of their backstory, knowing they were slaves, I can't imagine that at the end of a hard day's work, Pharaoh was like, all right, come in, I've spread out a banquet for you, right? They have a little bit of rose-colored glasses syndrome going on when it comes to looking back on their past. But nonetheless, it is probable they had more variety than just one thing. And so they're murmuring, they're complaining. In fact, it's so bad, and I would argue it's meant to be comical when we read the account in Numbers 11. It's so bad that at one point, Moses is walking past some of the tents of the children of Israel, and he literally hears them weeping because all they have is manna. And you just got to sit there for a second and be like, you children, right? Again, I think I probably would be right there with them, knowing my own flaws. But still, it's meant to be kind of comical. You're crying about having food. It's not the kind of food you want. It doesn't, at this point, you don't want to taste that over and over again, but it's food. You're in the wilderness. What do you expect? And instead of rejoicing at God's continued blessings, they're weeping as if some disaster has befallen them. And of course, not only is God angry at this, Moses is a little annoyed too, and I can't blame him. And he says to God, essentially, why are you doing this to me? Remember, there have been times where God's been angry at Israel, and Moses has stepped up and said, don't do too much against them. They can be redeemed. They can be brought back. Let me help them to come back to where they need to be. We've seen Moses do that several times. This time even Moses is fed up. He says, have I birthed these people? Are they really my responsibility? At this point, if I have to put up with these people, can you just kill me? Everyone's nerves obviously are strained. But God's solution is very interesting. He calls Moses, he calls some of the elders of Israel, he delivers a message to the congregation of Israel. And you know what he says? He says, I'm going to give you what you've asked for. You want meat? I'll give you meat. In fact, I'm going to bring quail into the camp. I'm going to bring quail in such an abundance that you're going to have plenty of meat. Once again, a demonstration of God's power, but he's not done yet. I'm going to bring quail tonight. I'm going to bring quail again for another meal, and another meal, and another meal. I'm going to bring so much quail, this is from the text, I'm not making this up, it's going to be coming out of your nose. And then see how much you like that. That last part's not the text, but that's the spirit of it, right? But he literally says, I'm going to give you so much, it's going to be coming out of your nostrils, and maybe, just maybe, implied in the text, you're going to learn a lesson here. And so he does. Quail comes flocking into the camp. Again, depending on the estimates of how many Israelites there were at this point, I mean, we're talking a camp that would rival any group of people we've ever seen in our lives, all collected in one place. And that entire camp, if I understand the math correctly, we're talking at least 3 feet deep in fluttering quail. Almost sounds like one of the plagues, doesn't it? Just a little bit? I know it's not, but that is what it turns into. Because not only has God told them, fine, I'll give you what you want, I'll give you so much, it'll be coming out of your nose. But as this quail descends on the camp, Israel once again proves themselves to be childish. Not only are they excited, not only do they immediately try and get this quail and eat it, essentially the way they're described, they turn into animals and just devour the quail as quickly as they can, stuff as much into their mouths as they can at once. And it's disgusting. In fact, it's so disgusting that the text tells us while the quail was still between their teeth, God struck many of the Israelites with a plague because ultimately of their lack of faith and faithfulness towards him throughout this whole situation. I want us to consider, just for a few moments tonight, a couple of things we can learn from this account in Numbers 11. The first thing I want us to consider is what the real problem is here. When Israel is complaining, notice it's implied in the text, but no one actually brings it out explicitly. Sometimes in stories like this and accounts like this in Scripture, it will be brought out very explicitly. It's just kind of implied here. But let's ask the question for our own sake. If we could go back to this congregation of Israel And we can ask, what is your real problem with your life right now, with your situation? What's really the issue? And they're going to say, all we've had is manna, we need... No. I hear that. What's the real problem? Are you hungry? Well, no, we're not hungry, but we have food to eat. But, okay. Are you thirsty? No, we're not thirsty. We've been provided with water as well. Not an easy feat, by the way, in a wilderness like this. Okay. Are you in danger of being attacked by the enemy? No, every battle that we fought, God has been right there for us. Sometimes we haven't even had to fight. He's just killed the enemy for us. Okay. Are you being provided for in other ways? Do you have shelter? Do you have clothing? Well, yeah. So what exactly is the problem? And once again, we get this picture of a child. Well, I want something that tastes different, right? I'm tired of the taste. I want something that suits my, not needs, but my desires a little bit better than they're being met right now. Now, they wouldn't want to admit that. I have found myself in similar situations many times where I've been frustrated, and if I were to take a step back, I realize it has nothing to do with a need not being met. It has to do with a want that I'm not getting. But that's really the problem, isn't it? It has nothing to do with anything they really need. Every need has been provided for, sometimes in the most powerful and miraculous of ways. But they're just not getting what they want. This is pretty similar to some other accounts we have in Scripture. Remember Naaman as he is seeking out someone to heal him of his leprosy? He goes to the prophet, and the prophet basically treats him almost as if he's just a non-issue. No one can cure leprosy, but the prophet doesn't even come out himself. He sends a servant and says, hey, dip yourself in that river a few times, and then you'll be cleansed. And Naaman's upset. He says, I thought surely he would come out and he would stand and call on his God and wave his hand and all this kind of stuff. That's what most people would do in this kind of scenario, usually to disguise the fact that they couldn't actually do anything. And of course, Naaman's servant is the real hero in this story because he essentially tells him, he's like, what's the real problem here? If you were asked to do something that was way harder, you would have done it in a heartbeat. The problem is simply that it wasn't done the way you wanted it done. And yet, isn't that most of human history when it comes to how we respond to God solving a problem? It's not that God hasn't solved the problem. He didn't do it the way I wanted him to. Think about Matthew chapter 6 as Jesus is preaching the Sermon on the Mount. If God so clothes the grass of the field, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? Now, I've told y'all before, I look a whole lot better now that I'm married, just in terms of my wardrobe, than I did when I was single. I have no fashion sense. We're just using this as an example. Is the necessity of having clothing about looking ritzy, looking like you have something, whether you do or not? Because a lot of people who dress like rich people don't actually have any money. Is it about the appearance, or is it about the basic necessity for clothing? The need is the necessity of being clothed, having warmth, having something to cover the shame of our nakedness, right? As the scriptures often talk about. That's the need. But how often do we get focused on, oh man, if only I could have the latest fashion? I'm not saying those of us in this room, I don't think most of us fall in that category, but that sure is something in the world. And maybe clothing isn't our thing, but we've got plenty of other areas where we want to have more than we actually need, don't we? Where we become discontented. Our society certainly doesn't help with that. Every advertisement that comes on the TV, you deserve this, you need this, you can't make it in the world without this. Notice what James says in James chapter 4. You do not have because you do not ask. If you need something, ask God for it. That's the same thing Jesus was saying in the Sermon on the Mount, right? But notice the next thing James says. You ask. Okay, now we're getting somewhere, right? And do not receive. Wait, I thought you just said if I ask, I'll receive. You don't receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions. Once again, is it actually about solving the problem, meeting a need? Or are we allowing the world to shift our focus to this is the way I want the need met? So when we think about a lesson we can learn from the Israelites' experience here, and this could apply to so many areas of life, not even just the material things, but whenever we ask for specific situations to occur in our lives, if it doesn't shake out maybe the way we want it to, we get upset. Are we upset because our needs actually aren't being met? Or because we're not getting it the way we want? We're not having our needs or even our wants being fulfilled in the way that we want. Those are two different things. That doesn't mean it's wrong to want things. But what matters is how high on our list those priorities are. And how we want something to happen, what we want specifically begins to overshadow our recognition that all things come from God. And honestly, we don't deserve any of what we have at all in the first place. But secondly, I want us to notice from our account that we've looked at tonight, God is willing to say yes. Notice, there was not a single thing that God refused of these complaints and, I wouldn't even say requests, demands that Israel made. He didn't say no. He said yes. Now that yes has an asterisk, right? And we'll see that even as we move on. But that's something we need to remember. Sometimes when we ask for something, God will say yes. But in hindsight, sometimes we would rather him not when all is said and done. Remember the story of Balaam. I believe we've talked about this. It hasn't been too long ago. Balaam is a prophet of sorts, and that's a whole story in and of itself. He is asked by a king to go and curse Israel. But Balaam, to his credit, he says, well, I've got to consult God first. I've got to consult the one true God, and whatever he says, that's what I have to do. And God says, no, Israel's my people. You're not going to curse them. And Balaam says, all right, I can't go. But that's not the end of the story, is it? Because the king sends more messengers back with more money, with more gifts. Now, does Balaam already know God's will in the matter? Not only does he know it, God is the one who directly told him, no, I don't want you to go. But Balaam says, maybe if I ask again. Because man, that gold sure is shiny, isn't it? And what does God do? I think this is the most interesting part of the whole story. God says, all right, rise, go with them. And then he tries to attack Balaam 3 different times with an angel to where his own donkey has to talk to him to tell him he's been an idiot. Because the whole point was, God said, yeah, go ahead, because obviously you're not listening to me anyway. You're trying to find any way to get around what I've told you. So go. And we'll see how I respond after you go and do your own thing, because obviously you're going to do it with or without me anyway. Incidentally, even after all of those events, while Balaam still doesn't curse Israel, he does tell the Moabites and this king exactly how to convince Israel to betray their God on their own. seducing them with idolatrous practices, with sexual immorality. That was all Balaam. He was going to do what he wanted, no matter what. Think about in Romans chapter 1, verse 24. This is a statement about, essentially, the pagan world. Of course, not everyone was in the situation of the Jewish people where they had a law given to them directly in the sense of the Mosaic law. And so all these people who were outside the law, as Paul emphasizes in Romans 1, they had much about God that was revealed to them, not in a written law, but through nature. As he says, his invisible attributes are clearly seen. But they didn't want that. And so what happened? They want to do other things. They want to go down their own path. They don't want to follow after the ways of God, the basic standards of morality that, to some extent, are known to all mankind, even though we like to ignore them as best we can sometimes. So what did God do? Did God send angels down to stop them from behaving in these immoral ways? No. He said, go ahead. Go ahead. Not in the sense of giving permission, but in the sense of, I'm not going to stop you. God gave them up to the lust of their heart, to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves. He didn't stop them. That doesn't mean it was a good thing. Going back to the Sermon on the Mount. The gate is wide. The way is easy that leads to destruction. And those who enter by it are many. Notice, God doesn't shut this gate. Do we need to say that again? God doesn't shut this gate. The way to destruction is wide open. People want to follow a path that is completely away from God, and God says yes. Not in approval. I guess we could say, in a sense, in resignation. Because if there's one thing God won't do, besides sin, it is to violate the free will of a human being. So when mankind says, I want to do it my own way, God says, all right. Many follow the path to destruction. If I insist on doing my own thing, God is not going to stop me. He didn't stop Israel when they asked for meat. But that's not the end of the story. And that's what we need to remember more than anything. That's the message of this account in Numbers 11. Because how many times have we seen a situation, we want it to go a certain way, we know that's not really the way that God has in store for things to go, but we want to do it anyway. And God doesn't stop us, so we go that path. And you know what every single human being throughout all of history has learned? When they go down the path away from God to try and do things their own way, the grass is not greener on the other side. Oh, it looks like it. We are convinced that it is. And when at first it's not, we just haven't gone far enough down the path. But it never gets any greener. Again, the imagery is directly out of the text. Kind of makes me shudder a little bit in disgust. Imagine a throng of people ripping into the flesh of these birds, and this image of meat literally coming out of their noses. Oh yeah, that's prosperity right there. No. That's an image of a people who is making a mess of their own lives. Again, we see this play out over and over and over again in the history of mankind. Israel wants a king. God doesn't stop him. But he does warn them. I want you, he says to Samuel, to tell them what it's going to be like for them to have a king. I want you to remind them the grass is not going to be greener on that other side. They didn't listen. And you know what basically the rest of Samuel and Kings and Chronicles is about? How awful life was in Israel because the grass wasn't greener on the other side. Oh, there were some good kings, in spite of what Israel had done, that were able to make some kind of a difference. But the net result was bad. Because what they thought would be a positive, what they thought was what they wanted, it only hurt them in the end. Think about the depictions in Proverbs, both I think that can be taken literally in terms of fornication, but also in terms of just the general appeal of sin and of foolishness, as he often uses it. The lips of a forbidden woman drip honey. Her speech is smoother than oil. So appealing. Surely this is a good thing. Not a good thing maybe morally, but in the heat of passion, who cares about that? It's going to be pleasant. It's going to be fun. It's going to be fulfilling. But in the end, she is bitter as wormwood. I don't think we have to go far in our society or any other one to ask, I hate to say the majority, but certainly a large percentage of the population, just how fulfilling was it to cheat on your spouse? Just how good was it to tear your family apart? Just how much pleasure did it bring you to cause untold complications and pain in your life because you couldn't control your desires? No, the grass is not greener on the other side. James says when desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. You see, we don't have to wonder. We don't have to get to the other side to know that the grass isn't greener. That's why stories like this are recorded for us. That's why we can learn from the past. Something you'll hear me say a lot in and out of a church setting, if you will, is that history in general, not just Bible history, but history in general exists for us to learn from the past. There's no point in studying history otherwise. And what we see that has happened, it's meant to keep us from making the same mistakes. I don't have to learn from experience if I can know ahead of time whether something is going to cause pain and hardship and destruction, both for my own personal life and for that of others. I just have to look to examples, and that will help me hopefully make a better decision. I think I've shared with you all before, my mom always told me, she says, listen, you need to make some mistakes because you need to learn. My job is to keep you from making the big mistakes because those, you don't have to learn those from experience. Other people have made enough of those kind of mistakes that I want you to learn from them and not have to learn by experience. Those are wise words. No matter how appealing it seems, my way never ends well. But God's way always does. Now, don't misunderstand what I just said. God's way may not go well, it seems, from a human perspective at first. It may not be easy, it may not be pleasant. It always ends well. Because life is not just about the here and now. In fact, it's least about that. It's about where we're headed. If we keep asking God for things that He knows will not be good for us, He will eventually say yes. He will. But we won't like what happens next. That was true for Israel. That's been true for God's people throughout all of history. And it hasn't changed today. If there's anything we can help you with this evening, to encourage you perhaps with an area of your life that you are pulled to carve your own path, doesn't seem like God's way is actually going to accomplish what you want it to accomplish. Let us encourage you. God's way is always worth it. And all of us have those moments of weakness where we begin to think otherwise. But that's part of why we're here. To help rein each other in, to pull each other back, to remind each other of the truth. So if we can help you in any way, please let us know as we stand and sing.
Hark the gentle voice of Jesus fallen tenderly upon you.